Hi, I'm here today with Brock Dolman. So welcome. Glad to have you on here.
Well, thanks for having me on, Alf. I appreciate your podcast and all your emails are always super interesting and on the cutting edge of these interesting questions about water and the planet and our relationship with it.
Thank you. Um, to start off, how about you share a little bit about how you got into water and restoring the water cycle?
I think I'm like everybody, we're all amphibians. So our first 9 months of life, we're aquatic. We are in the amniotic fluid there, and then the water breaks. And basically, here on planet water, I refer to us as bipedal sacks of saline solution because we've internalized our oceanic selves. And as a biologist, which I'm a biologist by birth and then subsequent training, I think that I'm have become really clear that on planet water, where life is endemic and water is life, life is carbon based, but mostly water. And so as a biologist, if I'm interested in creating conditions conducive for life, I have to be attentive to the carbon cycle and the water cycle and the nexus between those two cycles. And so it's kind of intrinsic. I went to UC Santa Cruz and did a double major in agroecology and conservation biology. And at some point, working as a biologist doing endangered species work, environmental impact reports, it became pretty clear to me that when the water cycle, the quantity and quality of water in a place had been compromised because of some human development, agriculture, forestry, ranching, urbanization, mining, that the carrying capacity for life was accordingly compromised. And often the endangered species driver for many of these species, the habitat loss, was actually impacts to water quality and quantity. So I really moved my, not that I'm still conservation biology focused, but I coined this whole idea of being a conservation hydrologist and really thinking about the whole system of, of planet water.
Mm. And then, as you kind of became this conservation hydrologist, how did you figure out what to do to restore the water cycle?
Well, I would say that another practice that have been professionally involved with for now 30 years as a teacher and designer is this thing called permaculture, and permaculture is a contraction of an idea of permanent agriculture coined by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, these Australians. And we at OAC have been a permaculture design training facility for just 30 years now. And I would just say that permaculture as a when I had the recognition that human settlement or more modern settler colonist human settlement patterns have been based on degenerative disturbances versus regenerative disturbances, unlike, say, traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous wisdom that composes with instead of imposes upon. In thinking about how do we retrofit modern human settlement patterns through, again, agroecology and conservation biology at landscape scales, it really, I think, ultimately occurred to me that the method of permaculture, where you have ethics and principles and a methodology of a site assessment and analyzing a system and understanding the system, and then creating a goal towards then developing a strategy to respond to whatever you observe. So it's really the application of permaculture design based on the intention of a restoration ecology, regenerative ecology framework, honoring the carbon and water cycle, again, on behalf of life cycles, which not just human life cycles, but creating conditions conducive for all species of life for all generations. So it's kind of a hybrid of those processes. There's very much the conceptual work, and then there's the design assessment work, and then there's the actual application or implementation of work. And that's a it depends
Oops.
answer. Energy flows, matter cycles, and life webs. And Dr. Art Sussman kind of coined that triumvirate there. And so the flowing of energy is really understanding the verbs in a system. The matter cycling is really understanding the matter, the nouns, the periodic chart of elements, if you will. And then life webs the nouns using the energy of verbs to create these incredible things called ecosystems. And ultimately this whole idea of the Gaia hypothesis of James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis's idea of this planet and the presence of life on this planet for 3.8 billion years has been creating conditions conducive for itself on the planet. And I want to get on board with that 3.8 billion years worth of wisdom.
Cool. So when I was learning permaculture, I learned this phrase: "Slow it, sink it, spread it." Is it true that you're the one that coined that phrase?
It is true. I coined that phrase. I'll often, my riff on it is slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, share it. That's kind of the
Okay.
full array of it. So we want to, it's sort of like how their Carlo Petrini had the slow food movement. And in response to McDonald's showing up in the Piazza di Spagna in Italy, in Rome there, and Carlo actually came to OAEC in the early 90s. We got to hang out. And so I really thought about this idea of what I call the slow water movement. And because we've had this fast water movement, we've been living in the drain age, or I would say the dominant land use paradigm of North America for hundreds of years since settlement, settler colonialism, has really been kill the beaver, genocide the native people, drain the wetlands, ditch the land, and dehydrate it for settlement patterns. Yeah, so we just really moved from a drain age paradigm where we're draining things and we're paving and piping and polluting and plundering and making it go away as fast as possible and as dirty as possible. We want to slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, and share it, and keep it around as clean and as long as possible. And so that's really the transition between to that idea of the slow it, spread it, sink it mantra, which really comes out of my work for decades in stormwater management and the Clean Water Act at the federal level, the Porter Cologne Act in California, and the recognition of non-point source pollution being a really big deal, and things called low impact development and stormwater management and rain gardens and bioswales and porous pavement and roof water catchment and groundwater recharge structures, that those retrofitting the land use to be a rehydrative sponge versus a dehydrative system. And that's really where I kind of synthesize the nugget of that idea as we need to slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, share it.
So, are you saying as a combo from your stormwater and your permaculture, and you're trying to condense it into a catchy phrase, and then that phrase came to you? Is that kind of?
Yeah, I mean, I approached when I began working in urban stormwater management and low impact development (LID) work. I again brought the perceptual design method worldview of as a permaculturalist. To me, permaculture is a method for basically how do we create regenerative and socially just systems that are based on natural patterns and processes. So when I was looking at stormwater management and green infrastructure versus say gray infrastructure, then we use the same tools, the principles of protracted and thoughtful observation and stacking functions and relative location with on-site resources, with planned redundancy, these basic permaculture design principles, and they apply to everything we do. And so slow it, spread it, sink it became a sticky meme that encapsulates sort of an ethos behind a deep level of work that the world is doing in the realms of stormwater management and low impact development.
Mm. So, do you want to explain some of the methodologies we can use to slow it, sink it, spread it, store it?
Sure. Well, I start with most of my work as an educator is what I call ecosystem restoration. And really the moment right now is that the ecosystem, the system of egos, us collective societal group of hominids, could use a 2.0 retrofit in the realms of ecological literacy, hydrological literacy, from this drain age mentality to the retain age. So the restoration is really trying to tell a new story about our relationship with the water cycle, with carbon cycles, with life cycles. And so I think that I often talk about the most important, whenever we're doing watershed work, we often talk about starting in the headwaters, in the upper parts of the system. But for me, the most important headwaters to start in is actually the water in our own heads, and actually the mitigation of cerebral imperviousness so that we can infiltrate the information into the headwaters and then through the heart waters, and then it emerges out of the hand waters where we get to do it. So the DIY is informed by the TIY, which is the think it ourselves, feel it ourselves, and then we do it ourselves. And so I think that's the conceptual educational part of the work. Then then I think you analyze a system, and it's whatever scale you're working at. You ask, I often start with the question, what would water want? And in want, meaning on behalf of its quality and its quantity in relationship to life, how can we support water in the presence of water in our landscape, in our home, in our farm, in our ranching operation, whatever the scale you're working at? How can we really think deeply about the water cycle connected to the carbon cycle, to those life cycles? And so where do we have, where is runoff? Where is water leaving the land at volumes and velocities greater than it was, say, in the pre-development, pre-settler condition? And where is it leaving maybe faster and full of sediment, dirt, or pollutants, or something else? And so though we look for those what I think of as keystone processes, and the relationship of landscape, and when precipitation comes to that landscape, snow, rain, fog, what is its interaction with that landscape before it, quote, goes away, wherever away is, the drainage, and how do we optimize the functionality of that system to retain the quantity appropriate to that system and preserve or enhance the quality of the water in that system? So that may look like roofs are impervious surfaces, and so maybe we put a roof water harvesting tank there to store water, because we can then use that in the dry season, and that decreases the runoff, and the overflow to the tank goes into a rain garden to infiltrate into the ground to reduce runoff and storm flood peaks, that we're now irrigating a vegetation community of edible plants or natives with that storm water, and we've stored water in the tank. And therefore our water budget of our home, we're balancing the budget to the amount of rainfall that lands on the site, versus either sucking it out of the ground with a well or stealing it from some other watershed through a municipal system, where you dammed up a big river and impacted that river, and you live in a pipe shed versus a watershed. So how can we reconnect to watersheds versus pipe sheds?
Mm. And then how about in agriculture? How can agriculture slow it, sink it, spread it, store it better?
Yeah, worked a lot with groups in California on agriculture. For a number of years, there was we had a whole group on water and food supply security through the Ag Innovations Network. If people look up Ag Innovations Network and look up the California Roundtable on Water and Food Supply, and we did a series of booklets on this that were published. And I think, again, agriculture, like anyone, there's a water budget. What's the crop they're growing? What are the soils that they have? What is their supply of water for, say, irrigation? Matching the crop to drop is always an interesting question. Efficiencies, drip versus flood irrigation, for instance. And then when the water runs off that landscape, is it cleaner or not because of the land use there? And I think increasingly what you see in agriculture in California, for instance, Governor Newsom just helped free up some regulation of looking at agricultural lands in valley bottoms where you have lower gradient systems with these big peak flow events, these atmospheric rivers we've been getting with the snow melt that we're getting right now because of this huge winter, that water that allowing rivers to reconnect to their floodplains as they had done before the drainage. When rivers talked to their floodplains, they slowed, they spread out, they sank, they stored and they shared, and they were full of beavers and riparian wetlands and off-channel habitats. And then generally what we've done again is kill the beaver, and then we straitjacket the river by putting levees, and we force it into a single channel, and we dehydrate the floodplains. And yet we put wells in the floodplains and the valley bottom. So we're sucking groundwater out of the piggy bank, but yet we're not allowing water to get back in the piggy bank because we're not allowing recharge. So how can we support groundwater recharge through reconnection of floodplains, and using agricultural land as one of those opportunities, because so many of those historic floodplains aren't functional floodplains anymore because they were dewatered on behalf of agriculture. So how can agriculture, certain types of agriculture, parts of a farm, that are conducive to it be reconnected to certain flood flows to recharge groundwater, slow the peak flow, sequester sediment, build carbon on site. And then agricultural water efficiency, obviously. Again, choosing the crop, like maybe as we're learning about the Colorado River system right now and the big dams and the mega drought, that 80 to 85% of all the water used in the Colorado River system is actually going to agriculture, and growing alfalfa in deserts to bundle up that hay for feeding confined animal feeding operations and other operations, or exporting it to Saudi Arabia, maybe isn't the wisest choice for water in a limited system like a desert like the Colorado River. So what are we using water for? And agriculture is really going to have to face up to that, and urbanization's really got to face up to that. Phoenix and Tucson and Los Angeles and Imperial Valley Water District, San Diego, Los Angeles, they're all having to face up to their reliance on a couple big dams in the Colorado River and this mega drought, and the fact that they dodged a little bit of a bullet this year, but it's not a long-term fix. And so everybody, I think, has to rethink our relationship to water and our connection to the quantity and quality, and pattern our land use according to the intrinsic characteristic of the watershed, and be in relations with our basin. It's what I call the basins of relations.
And so has your water institute been trying to change some of the agricultural practices? And if so, what have you been trying to do to change?
I mean, I think we've certainly been engaged with a number of agricultural producers. I think we focus, so the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center is an 80-acre piece of land in western Sonoma County. And it's an intentional community. 7 of us purchased it together in 1994. So we're going on our 30th year of living in intentional community. But there's also the OAEC, which is the 501c3, the nonprofit. And the land here had been being farmed or gardened biointensively since the mid-70s, when it was called the Farallons Institute's Rural Center. And those folks in the 80s put in an off-stream upland rainwater harvesting pond, a classic dam. And that's 100% of all the water for our entire agricultural operation here. So have been modeling off-stream storage of upland water holding capacity. And then during the big drought a few years ago, we retrofitted the entire farm to drip. And that saved over 80% of our annual water demand on the farm. We're the 6th oldest certified organic farm in California. And so I think we've been trying to model off-stream storage, water harvesting, irrigation efficiency, organic matter in soils, living soils, compost, water holding, mulching, plant choice, to demonstrate an integrated holistic framework. Again, we're a small operation, that's 3 acres, but the principles and the ideas are scale independent, they're scalable. And so, so we work a lot with other agriculturists, especially on upland water retention and recharge, soil health, carbon sequestration, irrigation efficiency.
Cool. You mentioned beavers. Do you want to share a little bit about the work you're doing with beavers and the importance of beavers to the water cycle?
Sure. My family all come out of Idaho and Montana, and I grew up around the Grand Tetons, Yellowstone, where there was a lot of beavers. So for me, beavers is a critter that, as someone who grew up fishing a lot, trout fishing, I always loved a good beaver pond because there was always big fish in that beaver pond. And so just kind of beavers to me were always just something that were just second nature. Living in California for the last 40 years and intensively here in Sonoma County for the last 30. So living in the Russian River Basin, I live in the Dutch Bill Creek watershed, the lower Russian River. The Russian River is historically a famous salmon-bearing watershed, Chinook salmon, coho, steelhead trout. These are anadromous fish. They're born in fresh water. They go to salt water, they get really big, they come back to fresh water, they spawn, and they die. They leave all those marine nutrients, the anadromous nutrient pump. In the Russian, the coho salmon were numbers of 50,000 in the 1950s. And by the year 2000, we were down to 6 to 10 fish. So a bunch of us as a conservation biologist a conservation hydrologist, was very involved in coho recovery and working on dam removal, habitat enhancement, in-stream flows, a number of things for the salmon. And I got to thinking about beavers and in the early 2000s, and nobody, to be honest with you, was really talking about beavers in California in the year 2000. They were considered mostly a non-native and mostly a nuisance, and people just wanted to kill them. And through a series of processes and meeting other folks, we eventually in 2012, the OAEC Water Institute created the Bring Back the Beaver campaign. We published a series, we co-published with other colleagues, a series of peer-reviewed papers on the historic ecology of beaver in California and the Sierra Nevada and the coastal zone, the Bay Area, asserting that they were more widely distributed than was thought. And in fact, they were native to much of the state. And then we really worked on articulating the benefits of beaver. So here you've got an aquatic, semi-aquatic mammal with big teeth and just enough smarts to figure out how to slow and spread and sink and store and share water. Their famous dam building capacities, the way they make their burrows. They're farmers. They irrigate the riparian because they're vegetarians, and they eat the bark of trees. They eat cattails. They eat willows. They eat sedges and rushes and grasses. So they're engineers that build dams. They're masons that seal the dams. They're farmers that irrigate food forests of riparian habitat. They recharge groundwater. They make wetted areas that are less flammable. So Smokey the beaver is helping to save Smokey the bear. Their wetlands are famous for sequestering carbon, and also that biodiversity in the wetland is a biofilter. So it's producing cleaner water with increased water quantity, with groundwater recharge, with carbon sequestration, with flood attenuation and fire resiliency, all the while making habitat for endangered species and other biodiversity for us. And they do it for free, and they do it better. So why not bring back the beaver? So that's what we've been working on for the last, like I said, 20 years, but very focused since our 11th year of the campaign. And I'm happy to say that in California, Governor Newsom last summer put a budget line in to create a brand new beaver restoration program to be managed by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. It has funding for 5 permanent staff, and they're in the process. The Department of Fish and Wildlife, or CDFW, has now hired those 5 staff. They're now working on a beaver management plan. We're working on depredation permits, like conditioning the permits to kill beaver. So it's more like a 3 strikes rule. How can we coexist with beaver, non-lethal coexistence with them, help the beaver be better beaver where they are instead of killing them? And in some cases, if need be, translocate or relocate beaver to areas where they used to be, especially mountain meadows, coastal waterways for salmon, riparian rangelands with cattle operations, urban streams, working a lot with tribal communities who want to bring back the beaver. And so that's a really exciting moment. And we're very happy that the governor and the Department of Fish and Wildlife have created this new program and are really launching what will be a historic program in California to bring back the beaver.
Congratulations. Thank you for all your efforts. I think we all thank you for that.
Sure.
And would you say that the beaver plays kind of a big role in how the west coast of the US, it plays a pretty big role in how the whole biome and the forest and all that grew in the west coast of the US?
So so beaver, what's interesting, so we're talking about a rodent, and in fact, on the planet, there are 2 species of beaver that are still living. And we have the North American beaver, Castor canadensis, and that is throughout most of Canada, throughout most of the lower 48 of the US. And in fact, they ranged into northern Mexico in the Sonoran Desert area. And then also there's Castor fiber, and that's all over Europe and Eurasia. So those 2 species. And what we do know is that the trapping of beaver, because their fur made incredible hats, and also their castoreum gland was used for perfumes and flavorings, they were nearly extincted in Europe in the 1300s and such. And then really one of the primary drivers of colonization of North America, especially across the top in the 1500s, 1600s, was the pursuit of beaver fur. And so the big fur companies, the Hudson Bay companies, the American fur companies, trapped their way across North America all the way over to the East Coast. And they started trapping in California in the late 1780s, all the way through the 1830s and 40s. People think about California, they think about the gold rush a lot, but what preceded the gold rush in California was actually what's called the fur rush. And in my opinion, actually the first rush in California I call the soul rush, which is when the Franciscan friars showed up here to missionize indigenous people. So there was a soul rush, then the fur rush, then the gold rush happened. And the fur rush, the removal of sea otters and fur seals and beavers and other fur-bearing animals, impacted our near shore waterways, our kelp beds by the loss of the sea otter as a keystone species, and the beavers in our mountain meadows, our coastal streams, our wetlands. So we basically killed out the wetland managers, the mountain meadow managers called the beaver, and then dehydrated that landscape to sell furs to make hats with. And so absolutely everywhere throughout North America, but especially in what's known as the arid mountain West and these Mediterranean climates, different than the East Coast where it's more humid and there's more water, the critical importance of beaver in the West, in the Great Basin, in the Rocky Mountains, in the Cascades, in the Sierras in California, where we have these short winters that are snow dominated and rain in the winter, and we have long dry seasons. The beaver are the ones that slow the flow. They slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, so they share it with all of life. And we need them differently and more critically out here in the West than maybe the East Coast or the Southeast, which are they're important out there too. But the West, I think folks really recognize in these mega droughts, there's a lot of ranchers in Idaho, Wyoming, Eastern Oregon right now, Utah, who are recognizing, in Nevada, for instance, is great ranchers there, who basically said 20, 30 years ago, we killed beavers. Right now, if we didn't have beavers, we'd be out of business in the drought because there'd be no water and we'd have to sell our cows off. And it's not just the water for the cows to drink, but the beavers rehydrate the valley bottoms, and that water laterally spreads out. And so the pastures for the cattle are getting subsurface irrigated. So the ranchers have both more water for cows to drink, and they have more forage that's irrigated longer, so they have more cattle food. So they get a double benefit out of working with beaver. So we often say that beaver and bovines are buddies.
Wow. So if people want to replicate what you helped to do in California with the beavers in other places around the world, do you have some hints about how they can go about, changing laws and changing, people's perceptions of beavers?
Sure. The interesting thing is California, we're kind of the last kids on the block to really get this. So we've actually been collaborating at the Water Institute's Bring Back the Beaver campaign, and my co-director, Kate Lundquist, we partner and have been learning from the folks in Utah and the work they've been pioneering, the folks in Eastern Washington with the Methow up in the Methow, or with the Tulalip tribe in Washington, who've been relocating beaver for a long time. Folks in Idaho that have really been on the leading edge of beaver restoration for the last decade plus. Some folks in the East Coast. There's actually a whole, and it'll be happening this year again in the late fall, early winter. The State of the Beaver Conference will be up in the Umpqua Valley of Oregon. And so folks, we come from all over the nation and internationally to get together every few years to talk about beaver restoration. Folks in the East Coast, the Beaver Institute, Mike Callahan, those folks have been doing amazing work for years. And then over in the UK and other places in Germany and France and Spain, there are whole communities that have been doing beaver restoration as part of a broader rewilding movement. And so there's a man named Derek Gow wrote a book about bringing back the beaver to the UK and their efforts that they have going on in Scotland and Wales and England and such, and in Germany's amazing work happening there. And so it's a global movement with two species. And so we in California have really been learning from and trying to model some of our work California, interestingly enough, no other state in the union is really arguing about the degree to which beaver was native throughout the state. That's been a unique fight in California. So we had a steeper hill to climb early on, which is why in 2012 and 2013, this group of us published these peer-reviewed papers in the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's journal on the historic ecology of beaver, because so we kind of had, it's taken us a little bit longer to get going because it's more complicated in California, and the degree to which beaver were trapped out so early by the 1830s that people forgot. And 100 years later, in the 1920s and 30s, they were trying to think about it, and beaver had been gone for 100 years. And so they were thought to be not as widely distributed. So then it was another 100 years later in 2012 when we published these papers. So we're doing work that's dealing with a 200-year realm of what I call the beaver blind spot. And it's a certain kind of amnesia that we're again having to awaken people to deal with. And thankfully, folks are woke on the beaver thing at this point in California, as I said earlier. And now we're rolling up our sleeves and implementing towards a management plan, coexistence strategies, relocation, and reclaiming the beavers. I would say beaver festivals have become quite a thing. The first beaver festival has been in the city of Martinez, and the work of Heidi Perryman and her organization called Worth a Dam. Really fascinating story. Look at that up. But there was just a beaver festival called the SLO, San Luis Obispo, the SLO Beaver Brigade. They hosted a beaver festival down near San Luis Obispo here recently. I just heard that there was one in the upper Midwest. There was one in Colorado. There's one over in Europe now. So a lot of communities are kind of rallying around and having these beaver festivals. And so that's the fun part about beavers, is they're a keystone species. And so whether you like water quantity, water quality, biodiversity, fire resiliency, groundwater recharge, carbon sequestration, beauty, just watchable wildlife, beaver have something to offer to everybody because they're really a nexus species. They're a solution species.
Mm. Well, it's good to hear that there's these festivals, and also good to hear that so much is going on else around the world. And yeah, it's kind of interesting. Like, I think sometimes when you first think about ecology and climate, you're just thinking that animals adapt to the conditions that are given, like to the water conditions, to the rain conditions. But actually, the animals themselves can alter the water cycle. So the beavers are actually shifting the way rivers flow, and also the small water cycle, and so maybe perhaps the rain patterns. And as a biologist, do you want to share if there's other keystone species that are helping slow it, sink it, spread it, or develop our water cycle?
Yeah, clearly beaver are in a class in and of themselves with respect to the interface with the water cycle. There's not really another species that dams up whole river systems, impounds whole rivers, reconnects floodplains, makes new wetlands to the magnitude that beaver really do.
Mm.
Moose have their own relationship in certain areas where there's moose. Grizzly bears are part of this kind of thing. The wolves are an interesting thing, where the wolves aren't necessarily doing the water cycle nexus, but what the wolves were doing, like the story of Yellowstone in the Lamar Valley, where the wolves were exterminated back in the, I think, 1910s or 20s, because people thought, get rid of the wolves and then there'll be more elk and more deer and more bison, more ungulates, more herbivores, and people wanted to see them. And what then was found is, many decades later, say in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, is that the creeks, like in the Lamar Valley, the creek channel was denuded and was collapsing and was incising and was eroding and was dewatering and was failing. And these hydrologists started looking at this and going, what is going on? We're in a national park. This is pristine wilderness. Why is our waterway collapsing? It looks like it's in an agricultural system that's been really hardly impacted. Meanwhile, the folks up on the slopes looking at aspens were like, God, there's only really old aspen and there's no baby aspen. And then finally, the wolf biologist showed up and said, we should remind you that wolves were removed from this system. And wolves, this is an idea called the trophic cascade, where a top carnivore like a wolf, when they're present in the system, and some people talk a lot about the ecology of fear, that the elk, in this case, the dominant herbivore of riparian systems, of willow thickets, of aspen groves, even more so than the bison, were allowed, their populations were allowed to overpopulate, and they were allowed to kind of get lazy and just hang out in the riparian corridor and hammer the willows and basically denude and devegetate the creeks, which then starved out the beavers. They lost out to the elk. And so the beavers were not long there any longer. And so they stopped managing dams, and the whole entire system began to unravel. So really the wolf is the keystone species that, by appropriately managing elk populations and keeping them on the move, could reduce the grazing pressure in the creek that allowed more willows to grow, that gave beaver food, so beaver could be better beavers to hold the water to restore the actual river valley. So, right, so it's this complicated thing where everybody's got a piece of the puzzle they're playing in this system.
Yeah, so it kind of speaks to the power of biodiversity and also kind of the whole causal chain in ecology. Like this is almost like a fourth degree causality, right? The wolves affecting the elk, affecting the trees, affecting the beaver, affecting the waterway. And so, so in looking at our ecosystems, it's like there's evolution that's kind of evolved this complex interplay of all these animals that are kind of controlling our water cycle in really interesting ways. And as we kind of take out the biodiversity in our world, like we're affecting the water cycles, both on the ground and also because the water evapotranspires in the air and creates rain, it's also affecting the rain cycles. And I don't think we're really looking at that enough. And I don't think people are aware of how biodiversity is affecting the water cycle.
Yeah. No, I know you, and thank you for your work on this, and others of us who've been involved in what is currently, often referred to as the slow water cycle, and water for climate, and some of this work of a number of amazing folks. Yeah, I think it's for those of us that will often, deforestation leads to degradation and desertification through dehydration. And anybody who doesn't understand that hasn't really paid attention enough. And I think the Amazon basin is really well studied and understood, of the relationship of evapotranspiration, plant sweat, if you will, and that connection of those plants, and how they create conditions conducive for more of a humid, more of a system that we know that's conducive in the temperature regime, like really people tracking temperature and condensation, and that what we know is that hot air rises and hot water rises. So if you clear cut a forest and the land is now scalding and baking, it's pushing that red heat up, if you will, that hot air up, which means the cloud formation is getting higher and isn't forming over that land and tends to move away and not rain in that place. So it's what we in permaculture we call stacking dysfunctions, where deforestation drives the dehydration cycle because you removed the evapotranspiration pumps that humidify the air, that seed the clouds, that allow that that small water cycle to kick in. And I think that's been really well documented and by a number of folks, and is really well observed. So how is it that through the appropriate relationship to vegetation and evapotranspiration and fire, where we have fewer trees but more forest in our Western systems that aren't overstocked with too many trees, and then where do beaver play in helping hold more water on the land to irrigate more of those trees so they're healthier and there's more water to evapotranspirate to help seed the vapor for the clouds and connect them. And when fire does show up, it's a slow moving, cool fire that doesn't replace the stand and burn the whole forest to the ground to black ash that then isn't conducive for rain formation. So I think, again, it's one of the keystone processes of earth, air, fire, water, and life is gaming all of those energy flows, matter cycles, and life webs. And life webs to create conditions conducive for its own fecundity, its own resiliency. And evolution, beaver evolved because it's Darwinian evolution. The better the beavers were, the better condition they were. They made more baby beavers and more right? It's not that it's not that complicated intellectually, but it's really complicated with respect to the relationship and the pattern. And the tragedy of the commons, if you will, is really that this worldview, this settler colonial extraction capitalist worldview, where the planet is perceived of as commodity versus community, and that we come in and we clear cut it, we take all the trees out, or we denude it, or we ditch it, and we drain it, or we plow it. Those activities, the last couple hundred years of this experiment, say in the lower 48 of the US, is showing itself that the condition of the landscape is lacking resiliency in a bunch of ways. And then you couple the emergent expression that our addiction to fossil fuels, the carbon, the liquid, the gas, the coal, the oil, that thus the extraction of those sequestered organic compounds by reliberating them and burning them up in the atmosphere, and the whole kicking off the process of the greenhouse effect being amplified and retaining more heat, called global warming, which then changes climates, is a double whammy. So now we're getting a climate change scenario where our weather patterns, our weather whiplash is becoming more erratic, and the droughts are deeper, and the floods are more intense and shorter. And that's all occurring on a landscape that has been so compromised because of the very development that created that greenhouse effect to amplify it, that it lacks resiliency in responding to it, right? So we see that runaway train effect, the snowball, what are known as a positive feedback loop, which is a negative thing, right? It's a runaway effect. And we're up against that. And so for some of us, how do we work with systems that both mitigate by reducing CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions on a mitigation side, while we do adaptation simultaneously to improve resiliency? And beavers do both. If they're growing forest, increasing photosynthesis, sequestering carbon in wetlands, they're bringing greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere and storing them in peat bogs and wet meadows and forest systems. I would remind people that if you want to pay attention to one chemical formula, it's the formula of photosynthesis, because you take a chloroplast in blue-green, in basically cyanobacteria, the original photosynthetic organism, which makes most of the oxygen on this planet in the oceans, is cyanobacteria. Then there was algae that figured out this trick, and then there's plants. So in the five, quote, kingdoms of life, bacteria, algae, plants do the photosynthesis, and animals and fungus are dependent on them and disassemble those molecules and are in a feedback loop where plants, algae, bacteria give off CO2, animals and fungus breathe oxygen, and we give off CO2, we breathe the oxygen, they give off the oxygen CO2 game, right? It's one of the great atmospheric trade agreements that life figured out like 2 billion years ago, is the CO2-O2 relationship. And what's interesting is the energy flowing into photosynthesis is sunlight, but the two molecules are 6 molecules of H2O, water, and 6 molecules of CO2. And then the magic of photosynthesis rearranges those into sugar, into polysaccharide chains, and liberates oxygen for us to breathe. And in the absence of photosynthesis, it's game over. So the point is equal inputs of CO2 and water, carbon cycle, water cycle, are the dominant inputs into photosynthesis. So if you're not playing on the carbon cycle side and the water cycle side, you're not creating conditions conducive for life, which is carbon-based and mostly water.
So photosynthesis is kind of coupling two of the key cycles on Earth, the carbon and the water cycle.
It is the keystone coupler. If photosynthesis wasn't happening, if life didn't evolve it 3 billion years ago, game over, we wouldn't be here. And all praise to bacteria, because they're the OGs. They started this off. In fact, I don't know, many people really maybe don't pay attention, but so all life at the 3.8 billion year mark until about 3 billion or 3.2, all life for that 800 million years was anaerobic. It was oxygenless life. It was anaerobic methanogenesis, the archaea. And then these cyanobacteria figured out this new trick, and they were floating around and they figured out photosynthesis. And the output of photosynthesis is free oxygen. And for another 800 million years, almost a billion years, free oxygen built up in the atmosphere. It was the most toxic thing ever to life because all life before that was anaerobic, and oxidization was the most toxic thing going. And basically the planet couldn't deal with the oxygen, so it rusted itself. And if you look at these things called banded iron formations or BIFs, you'll see that the planet for 800 billion years rusted through an oxidization process in the ocean, and sediment layered in the oceans and built up. And it's estimated that 80 to 90% of all the iron from the Iron Age that we've ever mined on this planet, for all the metal iron stuff we build, is the byproduct of the sediment of the planet that rusted for 800 million years because of life in the flatulence of bacteria farting out oxygen that no life could use. And then it was fungus and animals that evolved to take advantage of that oxygen and breathe it and give off CO2 that kicked off what then the really important next wave of evolution on this planet was, that connection. And it's all about gas exchange, and photosynthesis is the keystone driver of that. And then respiration of fungus and animals. So in metabolisms.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it's not just that geology affects life. Life actually affects geology, which then affects life again. So there's this feedback cycle.
Yeah, exactly. Geology, igneous rock, sedimentary rock, metamorphic rock, these geologic processes, plate tectonics and volcanism are the raw materials sculpting the planet. But biology gets in the way of some of those and affects geologic processes. So in fact, limestone, which we think of as geology, and if there's enough pressure and temperature, it becomes marble, and then people can sculpt it. But all that limestone, if you look at it, what is it? It's all fossils. It's all based on these little calcium-based life forms that grew in the ocean, and then they died and they sank to the bottom of it. So while limestone it happened over geologic time, its metabolic production and creation is all biology. It's 100% biology. Chert is an incredible rock. It's 100% the fossils of silicaceous organisms made out of silica. So when indigenous people here, they flint knap chert to make arrowheads, it's like glass. They're literally silicaceous glass. Like the geologic process of obsidian is a geology glass, chert is a biologic glass, right? So biology and geology are happening simultaneously because it's about time.
Yeah. I think the Gaia hypothesis by James Lovelock, he was trying to make clearer, like there's all these feedback loops, that it's not just the geology and the climate's affecting biology, but the biology is actually creating the conditions for life itself, the geology and the climate. And so the gases too, like the biology is creating the gases. And what was interesting when I interviewed Anastasia Makariva and who worked with Victor Gorshow on the biotic hypothesis, they were looking at biotic regulation, looking kind of similar ideas James Lovelock did. And they were looking at the water, and they were saying the water itself is also in a non-equilibrium state in the atmosphere. And I don't think James Lovelock looked at that. He was looking at the other gases, but it was very intriguing to say that, because James Lovelock was saying that gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, are in non-equilibrium states, but Makariva and Gorshow was saying, hey, the water vapor is also non-equilibrium. Is the biology affecting that, and keeping it at that critical state that creates life?
No, you're totally right. I think that, and yeah, again, Lovelock, because he was an atmospheric scientist, and he was asked to look at other planets and look at the atmospheres, and so yeah, he was really focused on that. But it was really oh gosh, I just said her name earlier. Now I'm spacing out. Lynn Margulis. Lynn Margulis was the biologist in the mix, and it was Lynn Margulis with James Lovelock who partnered together. And the Gaia hypothesis, the integrity of it from the biology perspective, the genius of that, all credit should be given to Lynn Margulis as a microbiologist. And she's the one who really brought in biology, and she coined the term planet water. She was the one thinking about the water cycle. And so I think it would be interesting to really unpack her role in when James, he gets a lot of the credit for it because he published the book under the title, but it was really the collaboration with Lynn. And
Mm.
there's an amazing movie about her for folks, that is, I think it's called Symbiotic Earth. And I would highly recommend everybody, I don't know how to stream it or find it where it's at, but Symbiotic Earth. Lynn Margulis was married to Carl Sagan. They're very smart people. Their son, Dorian Sagan, is still around, incredibly smart character. Check them out, I think. And what you'll find is that the nexus of what Anastasia and those guys were looking at on the water cycle, and I'll bet Lynn was there was a lot of overlap and shared convergent evolution, right? People really coming on to similar ideas when they think hard enough about it and evolving parallel theories because at some point it makes sense.
Right. Okay, cool. Yeah, I have to look at her work more. She was the one that kind of brought the whole idea of symbiosis into evolution too, right? Because before that, everyone's looking at evolution as competitive, and then she's saying, "Hey, look at all these species that are symbiotically evolving."
So that's the beauty of this film, Symbiotic Earth. And she absolutely is. And here's one of those tragic things about quote modern Western science is, gotta admit, it's steeped in a lot of sexism. And so as a woman in academia, she had a tougher row to hoe and didn't get a lot of the credit and didn't get a lot of the recognition at the time she did. And so I think going back and really unpacking and better understanding Lynn's work and many other amazing women scientists is an important piece of work. And the films, again, I can't say it enough, Symbiotic Earth is an incredible piece of work that will, I know the way you think, Alpha, you're gonna really and you're gonna have to watch it several times. It's really dense.
Mm. Yeah, and the whole idea of symbiosis coupled with the water cycle, I think is very intriguing. In I mean, like, and I think in ecology, and they kind of do mathematical models that try to look at how population ecology, like how each species is affecting other species. And I don't know how much they put in the species are actually affecting the water cycle, like, and then the water cycle then affects the species again. So there's kind of like they create these coupled equations or coupled cause and effects, and so kind of try to model this symbiotic effect. And I'd be interested to look at more how the symbiosis couples with the water in these, in these ecology and biological thought.
Yeah. Well, and so it totally love that. And I would just support that one angle on that is to say that um, uh, when we think of the water cycle, there's the typical kind of classic cycle of the ocean evaporates and it condenses and it pure distills and then it comes back down as solid liquid or rain and it goes into vegetation and groundwater, surface water, and returns to the ocean and evapotranspires. Boom. That's really the interesting piece about that is that the forest part, the evapotranspiration parts that Bill Mollison used to say, one of the co-founders of permaculture, that animals are just the mobile parts of the forest. And what I said earlier is the atom of life is carbon, but the molecule of life is water. All life, when it's actively respiring and metabolizing, is by volume mostly water. When a moss is dehydrated and dried up and not just in the summertime, it's still alive, but it's not mostly water. Then the rain comes and it swells up again and it becomes mostly water. So think about every life form and the volume of water it holds for every animal, every fungus, every tree, all of that. They are the water cycle. They're just the mobile, metabolically molecular part of the water cycle as another pool. They're the animal pool of water, the plant pool of water, the fungal pool, the bacterial pool is different than the atmospheric pool, the oceanic pool, the groundwater, right? They're all, and I think you're right that hasn't been teased apart in the scientific literature enough towards a symbiotic idea of this hypothesis. The Gaia hypothesis is wholly dependent on the fact that we live on planet water. No water, no life, full stop, right? And so the carbon cycle is the atom upon which the foundation of the molecule, the hydrocarbons and such, is built. But the lubricant of life is the liquidity of life, it's water.
Cool. maybe that's a good place to stop. Or do you have any more final words you want to share?
No, I just I'm happy to leave it there and just thank you for your deep thinking on this and supporting folks collectively to, yeah, think like a watershed, reconnect their relationship, their basins of relations, to slow it, spread it, sink it, but you first got to think it, and then you got some clean water to drink it. You know what I'm saying? So there you go. Just honor your bipedal sac of saline solution selves and your opposable thumb in your frontal lobe, and become a regenerative disturber and an agent for reconnecting with rehydration in this revolution.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for all your work with all the things you've been doing, like from the beavers to the greywater to the agriculture to the California plans. And I think your love of language has kind of seeped in, like it's it's left us legacy with the slow it, sink it, spread it, and I think also with a number of other phrases.
Yeah.
Do you just want to just share your website? What's your website with the Water Institute and OAEC?
Sure, you can just go to www.oaec.org. That's for Occidental Ecology Center. That's the main website. And then when you get there, you'll see you can click on the Water Institute and the Beaver campaign, or you might be interested in our wildlands program and could have a whole other show talking about the fuels to flows and the work that we've been doing on Slash Ain't Trash. It's beneficial biomass and limbing and thinning forests and stuffing gullies to do all this work as upland beavers. Beavers can really, in a watershed, if you actually had a map of a watershed and you put all the blue ink where the perennial waters are, where beavers could live and the fish live, that surface area of ink over that whole map is probably less than 10 or 15% of a watershed. Most of every watershed is uplands. It's terrestrial. And so if we don't act like beavers in the uplands and do the work to slow spread and sink up there so that the beaver have cleaner water, more water than the fish. So we've been doing a lot of work because OAC is all upland habitat. So folks might be interested in looking at some of that upland work where we're really connecting our fire fears with our water woes by bridging these fuels to flows. And again, that's carbon cycle, water cycle, life cycle, integrated whole system responses.
Cool. And then you also have a little template for if your community or your neighborhood wants to restore their watershed too, right? Some
Yeah, you
stuff
can
on that
find a
they can look up.
booklet. There's a booklet on the website, on the Water Institute website. Go to publications, and there's a booklet called Basins of Relations. And that's a fun little booklet that talks about that. And there's also our beaver booklet there. There's a lot of publications on the publication site. So check that out.
So the basins of relations, have you been trying to get that out to communities to help them
So
restore their
that
water?
back in 1999 through 2006, I did a training called Basins of Relations, starting and sustaining community watershed groups. And people would come for a 5-day residential training who all lived in a shared watershed or basin. And they were creating watershed councils and watershed groups, and then would go home to do that work. And a number of those still exist today. And so that idea of it's really community organizing work, to be honest with you. We at OAC ultimately we're a community organizing center. So we've had a school garden teacher training program for 25 years doing ecological literacy in public schools. We did community watershed organizing, doing the beaver organizing, the fire safe community resilient organizing. Work a lot with an amazing organization called Movement Generation, the Justice and Ecology Project. So we're really community organizers, but striving to integrate in the ecological literacy component simultaneously to a social justice or a just transition framework that's ecologically literate and socially regenerative and responsible.
So actually, I kind of want to bring up the thing you said earlier about the slow water movement. I know Erica Gies, who wrote What Water Wants, also suggests the idea of a slow water movement. And so it seems to me that your basins of relations would be one pillar that this slow water movement could stand on, like kind of getting a lot of communities around the world to start, redoing their watershed. Do you want to say a
Yeah,
little bit about your ideas of a slow water movement?
sure. And if you look that phrase up, you put in my name and slow water movement or slow it, spread it, sink it, you'll see an article that a woman named Catherine Cook interviewed me and co-wrote with me back in 2006, where I used this idea of slow water movement and slow it, spread it, sink it, store it, share it. And so and it's exactly what we've been talking about, like really promoting the consciousness of basins of relations, the community organizing around that, how we think like a watershed, how we do low impact development and best management practices for stormwater management and water quality and water quantity in the ag space, in the ranching space, in the urban space, the beaver space. And so I think I know Erica a little bit and her book. I'm almost done. I'm almost finished with the book. It's a wonderful read. And I totally appreciate that in her own journey in thinking about this as a journalist in the last some bunch of years, again, this idea of convergent evolution, it's at some level a reasonably obvious concept to come up with. And so I see it as a wonderful complement of convergent evolution and bringing it forth. And what's great about her book is then, you know, she did globe-trotted around and just these amazing stories out of Peru and India and, you know, the United States and other places, and talking about that. She actually has a chapter on beaver, which is wonderful too. So I think it's just the more the merrier, and bring it on at every scale of consciousness and demonstration for people to get the importance and the context of what we're talking about, that this is really fundamental and critical. It's really critical worldview opportunities to support us in thinking differently and acting differently in the face of what some of us call global weirding. And, you know, if the weather whiplash, which is real, and California's very deeply into this expression of it in the last couple of years, how do we buffer and ameliorate through that mitigation adaptation framework? To oftentimes I think of watersheds as living lifeboats, from ridge to river, from summit to sea, from stem to stern. We have to rethink and retrofit these living lifeboats at every scale of land use, from forestry to rangeland to agriculture to urbanization, suburbanization. How do we rethink and retrofit for rehydration? And the tools in the toolbox are different at different scales, but the pattern has continuity. So that opportunity for a slow water movement is before us. And if we're really looking at watersheds like living lifeboats, the opportunity to organize together is like battening down the hatches for the coming storm of the present and future moment, as these lifeboats are going to get tested. And some lifeboats, if we retrofit it again from summit to sea to be resilient and recharging and regenerative, will fare better in the storm if we all get together and pull in the same direction in a collaborative and convivial way, which is really about the community part of the relations in our basin versus the competitive part, that it's commodity and and the competition against. It's really community with.
I want to share a little idea I had of we could have like slow water circles where you can call the people in your neighborhood together to kind of discuss the idea of slow water. And because I think it's still not in the mainstream awareness, the idea of slow water. So you could, you know, watch a film together, maybe some of your stuff, just discuss what slow water could do in your neighborhood. And because it provides a solution for floods, for fires, for drought. And for water scarcity. So kind of have a discussion, and then maybe then you could kind of move to implementing stuff after the discussion.
I love it. No, it's a classic pattern, right? Like a book club or get together and study. And then your point of transitioning to then implementing and having projects. You know, an organization I'll just lift up here, who I think is modeling this and has been for a while, and I know stepping it up, is a group in Petaluma, Sonoma County here, although they work throughout the Bay Area, called Daily Acts. And Traithan Heckman and their crew, and I know that they're now involved in Petaluma. They're part of this whole Cool Cities Challenge, and they basically are doing similar to that. They're really looking at the city and looking at blocks of area and creating like block captains and neighborhood groups, and they're meeting. And then the beauty of Daily Acts is that they have been implementing these solutions. They've been doing roof water catchment. They've been doing greywater systems. They've been doing swales and bioswales and rain gardens and recharge that irrigate food forests and impervious surface removal and the education around that. But they bring groups together to actually implement it, and it's fun and it's a festive atmosphere, and they're very connected to the city of Petaluma, the county of Sonoma, broader entities. And so I think there's a model there. If you look up Daily Acts and their cool city challenge in the city of Petaluma, they're, but yeah, bring on a slow water circles. I think it makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I've met some of the Daily Acts people. They're pretty cool. And I think another group that's modeling is the Flow Project, the Flow Partnership in India, where they have over 1,000 villages, and they really focus on getting the community talking to each other and thinking about the water situation and what to do, and um, and then kind of working on it together, as opposed to so much of it top-down NGO that comes in and just says what everything you should do. They kind of get the, and then they kind of learn about what traditional Indians did, which actually is some of these slow water ideas that Joe had. And they have different names in swales and ponds, but they have Indian terms for it.
Yeah, and I think that's the fun part we know is that you know, the names should be custom and different based on the uniqueness and the cultural connectivity of wherever people come from. But what you find is that the in permaculture, we design from pattern to details, and then you implement from detail to pattern. And what you see is the names of the details are unique and custom, but the pattern has continuity from India to Africa to Asia to California, because gravity is universal. Water has a certain set of patterns. Photosynthesis works in India like it works in California, right? I mean, so the fun part is that's why it's really important to key your solutions to these intrinsic keystone processes and methodologies, because that's where then what the form looks like is unique, but the function has integrity because it's connected to intrinsic foundational patterns, right?
Mm.
And so I think that's what's super interesting. And you know, like for instance, we just had the blessing here at OAEC working with Water Stories and Zach Weiss and crew there to host Rajendra Singh, often referred to as the Waterman of India. And he's involved in many of these projects that you just talked about. And so he did a wonderful public talk at OAC, showed a film of their work, which is super inspiring, that you can find on waterstories.org. And then we did a workshop here. And yeah, I've spent time, I got to spend time in Zimbabwe with the amazing water harvesting, the late Zephaniah Piri, and be with him and work with those communities in the dry parts of Zimbabwe. And Zephaniah Piri was the inspiration for another close colleague, Brad Lancaster in Tucson, Arizona, who, if people don't know Brad Lancaster's work and rainwater harvesting for drylands and beyond, he's got a 2-volume set that are they are your Bibles, if you will, to water harvesting and that kind of work. And Brad had been in Zimbabwe and got inspired by Zephaniah Piri's work there. And so he's amazing. So I think, you know, we find these folks, the work of, I lived in the high Andean parts of Ecuador for 11 months, but I spent 4 months above 13,000 feet with a Quechua family who managed the ditch that had been there for 1,000 years of what would be called keyline in permaculture in Australia, of moving water from a concentrated source along an off-contour ditch that falls at 2% slope for 5 miles until it is used for irrigation for their upland potato patches, and living with them and managing that ditch and cleaning it and keeping that water flowing. But my first introduction to water harvesting was actually living on a kibbutz in Israel in 1983. And we went to the famous place in Masada above the Dead Sea, where that group of Israelites holed up on the top of Masada while the Romans built a ramp of earth to kill them. And they, in the Dead Sea area of the Negev desert, where you get less than an inch of rain, they carved grooves into the hillside on this little mountaintop plateau to harvest rainwater, run it off contour into a cistern built into the rocks. And they survived for years up there on rainwater harvesting. And when I saw that in 1983, my mind went crazy with thinking about this. And so hanging out with the permaculturalists, the Yeoman's Keyline thing, the Sepp Holzer kinds of world, the Rajendra Singh world, the Zephaniah Piris, like just anybody you can get to be engaged and witness this work and recognize everywhere there's slope and water, every culture has figured out how to have a relationship with that. Every rice paddy throughout Asia, imagine what those folks have been doing. The Qanats of the Arabian Peninsula are amazing. In Yemen, these terraces in Yemen are amazing. So we abandoned gravity in the sort of post 50s world where we had enough fossil fuels and electrification through the damming of rivers to generate pumps. And the green revolution of agriculture that was brought forward with Norman Borlaug and all of that work to quote, feed the world, was irrigated by a silent blue revolution that was based on the unsustainable extraction of groundwater through the electrification of that, based on the damming of big rivers for hydroelectric. So as soon as we coupled electricity to extract water and pump water, we abandoned the sacred relationship to the subtlety and nuance of being in relationship with water and gravity. And that was one of the great conundrums that I think we're learning from beavers, how to get back there again.
Mm. Wow. Well, thank you for that wide and coverage of a lot of things there. And yeah, it's good to know that all around the world there's a lot of different stuff being done, and that kind of creating the slow water movement. And also, like, yeah, there's a lot of paradigms that have problematically that we have to yeah.
I forgot my favorite, not my favorite, but one of them I spent a bunch of time looking with is in Polynesia, and specifically in Hawaii, is their system called the A'opua'a system, where you've got these volcanic cone-shaped landscapes, and the watersheds that divide off of those are like pie shapes, and the entire cultural setup for the land use pattern of the Hawaiian Islands was based on this A'opua'a, from the ridge in the top of the volcano where the sacred goddess of Pele runs the show, and how that water moved down in a watershed all the way out to the beach and eventually to the reef, and how they patterned those systems for the key point in permacultural key line, where the erosional to depositional transition in a sine wave curve, and you intercept that flow in the main channel, and you slowly pull it off onto the hill slopes like an acequia ditch of New Mexico at a 1% slope, and then you pull those irrigated canals off, and then you gravity feed, in their case, taro paddies versus rice paddies of Asia, or bean fields in New Mexico. And it's the same idea. And then the food forests were below the taro paddies or surrounding them on the hill slopes. And then the village was down in the low elevations. And then the fish ponds were in the intertidal zone of the coral reef. And their entire patterning of those islands, for the amazing fecundity they had, was watershed consciousness based on a slow water movement. In their case, for taro. If an alien lands here and was to ask any culture, and I could ask one question of a culture, I would say, take me to your carbohydrate. And if I get taro in Polynesia, I get rice in Asia, I got bananas or teff in Africa, I get cassava or potatoes in South America, I got corn in the Americas. The carbohydrate and how people irrigated that or not is the nexus of traditional ecological knowledge and traditional indigenous hydroengineering.
Wow, that sounds amazing. Cool.
All righty.
Well, thank you so much for coming on, and yeah, I appreciate it.
All right.
Okay.
All right, take care, Alpha.